Hello, everyone. My name's Justin. I am the Associate Creative Director of Messaging here at ShapeBy. I am healthily obsessed with words and the power of language and how we bring language and words and verbal identity together with Simon's domain.
Hi, I'm Simon Tandy. I'm the design director here at ShapeBy, and I'm going to be coming at this conversation very much from a visual branding aspect. Me and Justin are going to be talking about how the two are so intertwined. So I'm going to be talking about visual systems that help make brands memorable. So how they pull on a toolkit of different elements to help tell those stories, build worlds and create experiences, and importantly, how they can stay authentic to their sort of core brand values.
And together, Simon and I will wrap up with how these two visual and verbal worlds come powerfully together to create harmonious, effective, distinctive, and importantly, bold brands, because that's why we're all here, right? So that's Simon and myself. But you're probably wondering why yin yang, and why the white backgrounds and the black backgrounds that Simon and I have worked really hard to coordinate so beautifully today. But yin and yang, it felt like a really useful analogy, if you like, for brand harmony, and for the way that Simon and I work together as well. So whilst they are two distinct but inseparable forces. So for us, visual identity and verbal identity are interconnected and complementary. And when they come together, they work off each other and feed off each other and play with each other to create strong, dynamic, bold, and very importantly, cohesive brand identities. So we will talk a lot about yin and yang, art and copy, sights and sounds, head and heart, push and pull, because we really believe that there are two core elements to the most effective, the most powerful, and the boldest of brands.
So looking at let's look at what do we mean by visual branding in essence. So it's how a brand looks, how it shows up, how it feels to the outside world. Like I mentioned before, it's a collection of design elements. So you've got at the sort of core form of it, you've got a logo, you have typography, colors, photography, illustration, layout. There's that's the sort of the core basics of a brand system. One of the key things, obviously, with building any kind of brand equity is to make sure that there's consistency across this. To ensure the reason why a brand needs to remain consistent is to ensure everything, from your banner ads to your website feel connected, in essence. So consistency is key, but at the same time, what we don't want to do is design ourselves into a box as such. So I think the key to any successful brand is to have that level of agility and flex within the visual system in order to evolve, stay of the moment and relevant, and leave your brand system as a sort of basis to build from, rather than, like I say, a sort of closed off box that you can't explore outside of.
And we talk a lot about brands being kind of living entities as well, right? So they're not fixed in a moment in time. So to that point about them not being static and being able to move as culture and the world around them evolves, that's super important. Super important.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think part of any design system, and especially it's more relevant today than it ever has been, is just that level of adding movement and motion to the brand. So whereas I think motion was once considered a sort of a layer that you add to add interest to a brand system, I think now it's expected that motion is part and is a key part of that brand language itself. So so having some, the ability to explore motion and to add expression and dial up and down levels of emotion, I think is a real key part of that system to be able to draw upon. So another part, obviously, of a strong brand system is to make sure that you're a lot more than just your logo as such. The logo is an important thing, but it's a good visual brand system should cover all your touch points. How do you show up on a website? How immersive is your UX? Your everyday social digital presence, are you culturally relevant, for example? That should always be evolving. And then you look down to things like physical packaging for some brands, out-of-home advertising, signage. All good design systems should enable you to dial up and down the balance of all these different elements to work across those deliverables. Getting the ingredients right, having them is one thing. Getting them right and working with them in different levels is obviously key to any brand. So there needs to be a level of familiarity, I think, with a brand, which is key. But you want it to be iconic and constant. So, like we mentioned before about staying relevant, new, and exciting. That's the balance you have to tie. So if you're hitting people with something new every time, then you're going to lose a little bit of that familiarity. So you've got to just make sure that you're getting the balance right there. I know we sort of talk a bit about how to make that emotional connection with audiences. So when we're looking at those elements that are part of our design systems, colors, fonts, style, shape how people feel about our brands that we create.
Well, I think what's lovely, and you are so right, is that if there is one theme or thread that goes through everything we say, it will be that feeling piece, right? Because there's a lovely, slightly obsessed by the film Inside Out and Inside Out 2, because there's a great quote that talks about how we humans are feeling creatures who think, not thinking creatures who feel. So our first response to anything is always emotive. We feel, we think, then we do. You know what I mean? Rarely do we think first. We should probably think first a little bit more, but unfortunately, our general first reaction to things is, how does that make that feel? How do I feel about this when I see things? And I think, to your point, Si, is that's why those kind of initial responses and reactions to visual brands are so important. How does this make you feel? How do we want people to feel, when they see our brand? How are they feeling before they interact with our brand? How do we want them to feel afterwards? I think these are super important considerations, obviously verbally from my world, but massive when it comes to visual language.
Yeah, and ultimately, those feelings help make you more memorable, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a lovely piece, and again, I'll talk about it in a bit, but those kind of, they talk about kind of emotions being Velcro for memories as well. So the more we can make people feel something, the more that sticks. There's that lovely, I think, the Maya Angelou quote that says, people will forget what you say. It kind of hurts as a writer a little bit, but they will always remember how you made them feel. And I think that's so important when it comes to that yin yang of brand.
Yeah.
So thanks, Si. Verbal branding is my obsession. And there's a lovely this guy called Chris West who wrote a wonderful book on verbal branding, and he talks about verbal brand is your brand strategy given life and given breath. So we use our choice of words, our choice of language to really kind of connect with people and help them to identify with us as a brand. So when I talk about kind of verbal branding, it's your brand voice, it's your tone and how you're able to flex that tone so that you show up at different moments. It's storytelling, it's narrative, it's scripts, it's content, it's social posts. It's your responses in the comments to social posts as well. So our verbal branding, our choice of words and the words we choose to use don't just convey kind of meaning or information. They convey emotions too. So, reassurance, trust, excitement, joy, all these things we can help to kind of shape through our choice of language. And I think also it's really important that we have a clear, consistent brand language, but also that we're able to flex that to suit our particular audience that we're talking to as well. So we want people to be able to hear themselves and see themselves in the way that we talk as a brand, because that's super powerful. And this comes back to everything that Simon and I talk about. That's how we build those meaningful emotional connections. That's the power of verbal brand.
And yeah, I think, beautifully said, Justin. I think we spoke before about how one can't work without the other, right? And I always
Completely.
think that, from coming at something from a visual point of view, you need that sort of organizing thought to even begin with, so that's where, in order for us to kick off with our ideation, the importance of having that verbal aspect in there right from the get-go adds so much more meaning to and direction to the visual language itself. So
I think it's how we like to work, right? So is that we will have, some will call it an organizing thought, or a kind of very succinct brand story, but exactly that is what do we want people to kind of feel when they come into contact with our visuals or with our words. And it also, this is our kind of, I guess this is our flag in the ground, right? This is our kind of our rallying cry and our statement that kind of shapes and defines everything we do. Exactly like you say, from a visual point of view, from a motion point of view, from a messaging and storytelling point of view as well. Because it just comes back to that idea about consistency. Consistency is so powerful, and consistency breeds commitment. And if we can breed commitment, we will breed loyalty and trust and success for our brands as well. But those two,
and community as well, right? You sort of
massively, mate.
These days, all the strongest brands are built around a community, and that is the modern way of marketing these days, isn't it?
Yeah. I identify with those brands, and I see myself as part of that community. That's so important. It's so valuable.
Yeah. And like your choice of brand that you follow, it says a lot about you, your personality, your aspirations, and obviously that your verbal side of things. You're there to back that up. You're there to stick a stake in the ground, stick a promise to the brand, and quantify everything that we're trying to get across in a visual system as well. So,
and the brands become so pervasive. We don't search for things; we Google them, right?
Yeah.
I mean? So right? they become part of our. They're so powerful. They become part of our everyday vernacular, which is scary and exciting in equal measures.
Yeah.
Maybe. So as we said, verbal branding is the yang to Simon's yin, if we like. And forgive us for constantly mentioning our yin and yang analogy.
Is it not obvious enough?
It will be by the end of this. So again, verbal branding is how your brand sounds and what the brand says as well. And brand voice gives both context and meaning, and it gives depth and feeling to our visual identity as well. The two have to complement each other, because our words will help to build trust, explain purpose, and forge those super important lasting connections that we talk about. One example that pops to mind is that we're shaped by, obviously, and we don't have kind of employees or members of staff. Personally, I despise both those words. Horribly impersonal, almost as much as I dislike the phrase human resources. But that's a conversation for a different time. So it's shaped by we're shapelings. You know, you join us, and as soon as you walk through our doors, you are a shapeling, which is ownable, distinctive, and it's very us. Because one of our tone of voice principles is about is about being bold, original, and human. So it's really important that we carry those kind of key brand personality traits and principles into how we sound to give life to everything else that we do as well. So,
and we work out of a studio, not an office, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Seems like a small detail, but
So we have out of studio replies, right? Not
yes,
never out.
That's right.
Never out of office responses.
I'm just making a note that we need to update that terminology.
But I think that, as you said, this is we use verbal identity to express our personality.
Yeah.
So to bring who we are to life and help people to see, kind of those words are a window into our soul in many ways, which sounds a little bit overly poetic, but so that means as you say, how do we define our tone of voice? Which words do we choose to use? Back to that employees versus shapelings thing, and also how we give our writing pace, rhythm, and energy as well. How we're able to flex our tone for different moments, because maybe the shape by that we sound like on LinkedIn, for example, a little bit different maybe to how we sound in Instagram comments. I'm Justin, but the way I maybe talk to some of my clients is different to the way I talk to my 10-year-old boy. We're able to flex our tone, that we show up in the right way at the right moments. And verbal identity means how we use how we use sentences, short sentences, long sentences, how we use grammar, how we try not to use too many M dashes. I'm looking at AI right now.
Well,
another M dash.
Without running the risk of diving into the AI conversation, it's worth touching on, because I liked your point around adding rhythm, knowing when to dial up and down certain parts of your brand story. And I think that is going to be so key moving forward, right? And, like with the accessibility of AI now, there will be this big gush of content.
It will
verbally
be,
and visually, and it's going to be out there. And I think the real craft for both of us is going to be around how do you create, how do you tell those stories and dial up what's important? It could be a tiny little macro interaction. It could be something a lot bigger that lands. But having the ability, I think, to look at flow and how content is digested is going to be key, I think.
I think so, mate. If that old quote about if the only tool you've got is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, for example. So if everyone's using AI, how do we kind of make sure that we aren't just kind of churning out the same as everyone else? So that human element is so important, and just bringing, we'll talk about this when we get into how the two work together, but just being able to kind of dial up that confidence, that belief, and that conviction. And just, for me, verbal identity is so important, because it doesn't just mean having a tone of voice, it means having a point of view as well, right? It's have a take, have a perspective, believe in something, stand for something, stand against something, right? That's really powerful. And when we bring our verbal and visual brands together, we can do that in some really exciting, interesting, and distinctive ways.
Yeah,
and have a lot
absolutely.
of fun.
I think that goes back to the point that we spoke about at the very start around staying relevant, right? And if you design yourself into a box too early on, and you only ever say the same thing in 2 or 3 different ways, your brand's instantly going to dry up very quickly.
Yeah.
And actually,
you are wallpaper.
You may as well be getting AI to do it for you. If you've got a system where you've got the ability to flex and you're agile enough, to play on some of those cultural moments and to dial up those levels of excitement. And in your storytelling, I think you'll last a lot longer.
Yeah.
Your shelf life will be will be a lot better than the next person's.
As creatives, we and I talk a lot about, one of the few skills I have maybe is kind of empathy, right? Is being able to kind of understand or read the room, for example, and think, okay, well, in this situation, we can dial this up a little bit more. Let's play with that. Or we need to be aware that this is happening. So we need to maybe dial that down a little bit. So, if we have a brand system, that kind of a visual and verbal brand identity that is just one size fits all, we're in all sorts of trouble. But so we need to be able to kind of flex and adjust, dial up or dial down, depending on the audience we're talking to, depending on the context, and depending on the emotional state of our audience. How are they feeling right now? What's happening in their world that we need to do that. And that's why, as you talk about, Si, is that having that kind of that design system, rather than just, okay, here's some guidelines that say do this or don't do that. That's not built for the world we're in anymore. We need kind of visual and verbal together with enough flex, stretch, and kind of elasticity that we can make sure they work really bloody hard.
And we obviously talk a lot about levels of boldness, don't we? Here, hence the badges. But yeah, I clocked it. Yeah,
sorry, I'm not sure if it was a visual side.
But yeah, sort of like how do you dial up and down boldness? What's bold to one person is certainly might not be to the next. So it's interesting, isn't it? Just taking examples of brands that have been bold, and I've mentioned to you before around Monzo as an example. Within the banking sector, they came in at it with nothing but a color, right? They had this one color, and that was what they were going to hang their hat on. But that color alone teamed up with the fact that they weren't even going to touch photography. Let's get away from that. That's what everyone else is doing in this sector. Let's run with the color. Let's run with the card. Let's back it up with some nice illustrations. And straight away, they set themselves apart from anyone else, and they gather this huge following, big community off the back of it, and essentially sort of changed the banking sector, certainly within the UK, for good. And they got a lot of people chasing after them and trying to do the same sort of thing.
I think you're right. I think they were, the first challenger bank, I think, a proper challenger bank in the UK. And as you say, out of that hot coral card, which was like, banks, you just don't do that, right? Just don't do that. Yeah. And out of that came a tone of voice that sounded very unbank-like, because people, real people don't speak like that, or certainly the customers they wanted to attract don't want to be talked to like that. We want to, we want to kind of debunk banking and make it sound like a real conversation, rather than, oh bugger, I'm talking to a bank manager.
Yeah. I mean, I think the color itself became its identity, right? I'm not sure I even knew what the Monzo logo looked like for the first 6 months or so I was using it. I was just happy to flash my card out every time I was paying for something, and it says something about your personality when you've got that in your wallet. And I know that now millions of people have it, but it's that in itself, there was a lot of brand equity in it to start with, but it was what does it say about you, and what you feel about the banking sector in general, and are you on board for the ride, essentially?
And it's a beautiful example of the first connection was an emotional one. It wasn't a rational or logical connection. It was very visceral and very emotive. And that's how, as you say, they managed to kind of build that loyalty, that community, and really deepen that connection. They're a great example of a truly bold brand, I think. And again, they've stuck to that consistently while they evolve and they kind of adapt and change. fundamentally, they're the bold challenger brand they've always been, although some may disagree. But again, that's another story. Incidentally, I was reading. I saw a lovely quote on the Guardian website today about an author who was talking, and again, it just reminded me of boldness. But he said he's managed to stick to what he believes in by staying true to yourself and flying close to the sun. And I thought that just struck me. If I'm kind of defining bold brands, stay true to yourself and fly close to the sun, right? Felt really powerful and really interesting.
Absolutely. Have ambition, but make sure, you're not trying to pull off something that you're not,
Yes.
Get behind who you are, wear it on your sleeve, and be proud of it. And be up for taking risks as well, like we talk about, you need to have space to grow and evolve, grow the business. It's that's it all comes under that banner of boldness and authenticity. So it's essentially like, visuals, enable you to land that first impression first and foremost, don't they? So it gives your audience a reason to want to discover more, and be associated with you. Aesthetics essentially are sort of, attract much in the same way as we do as human beings, right? We're drawn to one another for various reasons, various signals we give off. Which is, rounds home that point about authenticity again. Make sure if you're saying something bold about yourself, make sure it's true to who you are, because people will see through that pretty quickly if you're trying to pretend, to be someone else.
And there is no quicker way to destroy trust or loyalty than through, as you say, either kind of trying to be something you're not, or just being frighteningly inconsistent with how you're using your visual or verbal language as well, because those kind of schizophrenic brand experiences where 1 minute you're a kind of, you're a high school senior, the next you're a kind of, semi-retired management accountant. It's like your audience is kind of, who is this person? Who is this brand? If I can't kind of place the brand, how can I find a place in my world for them? If that makes sense. And also back to your point about kind of, visuals working really hard at that kind of first reaction. Sometimes we don't need copy, right? Which is again slightly disturbing thing for a copywriter to say.
But I would happily say the other way around as well. You don't always need any visuals.
Yeah.
Sometimes some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen are just a nicely spaced out headline on a page, on a blank page. Yeah. And if those words are giving you everything you need to, then that is all you need to take away. And that's sort of goes back to, again, Nike, dialing up those different levels.
Nike's a great example. Sometimes it's very kind of just bold headline only stuff. Sometimes you have that beautiful marriage and stuff. But again, I think it's knowing that, we don't paint by numbers here. It's okay. What is the best way for this piece of communication to have the positive effect that we want it to have? And I think that's why we don't go in thinking it must be X or it must be Y. It's let's start with a problem. We have our kind of visual and verbal brand system. Let's work out the best way to flex to achieve what we need to achieve. So, yeah. I mean, things generally work better with copy, I would say, as a writer.
Hey, I wouldn't argue that. Like I said, we, as designers, we need something to go on, and if you can come up with a beautiful organizing thought, it's instantly, you're out of the blocks. When it comes to ideation. So, that is so key for holding everything together. That they have to work and synchronize with one another to be powerful enough. If you lose one, then the other one falls off a cliff very quickly.
It's like this yin and yang analogy actually works. So
I think it is, isn't it? Should we keep it in?
We've come too far now.
Well, there's always post-production, Justin. We can always change the colours of our backgrounds. Add some effects in.
So we approach census like we approach every piece of work. Once we've kind of done our discovery or analysis, we look to align and position census around their core strength. So we very quickly kind of centered around the fact that only census offers the kind of the depth of internet visibility and that sense of clarity. We talk about census being the map of everything on and connected to the internet. No one else is doing that. No one else can do it at the depth and the scale and that real-time view that census can. So we had a great positioning to work with, already very distinctive, already differentiated, and already very ownable. So we started by exploring three territories. And as Si alluded to earlier, we like to start with an organizing thought. So what is the kind of the one sentence, the thought in words that allows us to kind of explore visually and verbally where we can take this campaign? So we explored three thoughts. The thought we all kind of came together around was where meets why. Because when you can see everything on the internet that's connected to the internet, when you can understand where everything is and why it's there, you suddenly have that kind of, visibility meets insight, and that gives you context and control. So this felt like a very kind of rich creative territory from a language point of view, from a messaging point of view, and importantly, from a visual point of view, for us to go ahead and explore. I might slip into map puns.
Oh, more map puns the better, I think, Justin. Please do.
So it was a really simple idea. And as you say, we got to that idea about census being the map of the internet. And that concept of where meets why, that very simply expresses kind of what census offers and why it's so important as well. So again, that was really rich, fertile ground for us to do some visual exploring.
Yeah, I mean, I think, off the back of your body of work, Justin, I think it set us up beautifully, really, for diving into how do we bring something which is incredibly complex to life and make it coherent enough, I guess, for our audience to have some level of understanding. And I think that's perhaps where the brand was falling down. It was there wasn't, like I say, that level of sophistication and complexity that they were really able to tell in their stories. So tackling the map of the internet, that was a biggie in itself, but just having that grounding messaging of where meets why was a beautiful place to start. We typically kick off all of our processes like this is doing a branding and competitor audit as such. So looking at those core assets that the brand was using, and actually some color came up as being a pretty key topic early on, because the client itself hadn't actually seen the landscape they operated in as far as just using color across the board. And it highlighted straight away that actually what they'd done was follow the lead with a lot of similar operating companies using an orange. So although their orange, they held a level of brand equity, I guess, through the orange, it needed updating. And actually what we did with it was look at was pairing it back, toning it down a little bit and using it much more as an accent color, which allowed this more sophisticated palette to take shape around it as well. The logo was another big point of discussion. I think initially the client felt that the logo itself didn't necessarily need to be updated, but after looking at it under the microscope, we're able to make a few subtle refinements. In essence, the bones of it were great, and it said something about the company, which was great, within that mark. But I think it just needed that level of motion to bring to it to really make it a bit more of a dynamic identity, essentially. So we were able to add an extra deeper level of storytelling just to the logo mark. And like I said, it sort of all comes back to that organizing thought of delving deeper, uncovering more, showing a picture of that landscape. And then that was the sort of starting blocks really for looking into things like photography treatment. How does the overlays that the way we treated the photography, how does that sing alongside the iconography set that we worked on, drilling down into infographics. It all had to be cohesive. I think we ended up with a really bold identity. We talk about different levels of bold, but even if we drill into one of the aspects we looked at in regards to the typography, it was actually a subtle shift from where they were, but it just added enough character to them to give it that extra meaning and that personality to it. So there was lots of different levels that we had to sort of look into and dial up. But I think what we ended up with was a final sort of package as such, which gave the client a really lovely basis to kick on with, and move forward and really own that sector. Like you say, it's a product that no one else had, but there were other people making noises within the space to try and pull attention away from it. But it's I think it's a piece that we can all be really proud about, from both aspects. And it's a great example of those visual and verbal systems coming together.
There's a golden thread that runs through everything Census. So from a visual point of view, from a verbal point of view, as you mentioned, Si, to the thought and detail that's gone into the logo as well, and through all of the motion pieces. Motion is so central to Census because it's a map that's ever growing as well. And I think we looked at we defined their tone of voice. We put sort of kind of a copywriting style guide together. We looked at a messaging matrix as well as all the kind of visual work, so that and Simon talks a lot about those kind of those design systems. We wanted to make sure that they had a very robust, flexible, and hardworking visual and verbal system that could kind of develop as sensors develop as well, as the map continues to grow and expand, because brands can't be a fixed point in time, right? They have to be living and breathing. And I think it's a lovely example of visual and verbal, living and breathing, and bold and ownable, which is
absolutely
the sweet spot, hopefully.
That's what we aim for.
Absolutely. So I think it's time for us to wrap things up.
Absolutely.
Right,
yeah. I think it's probably time. And yes, if you're happy to take that on,
shall I? Being the verbal side,
of many great words. So
far too many words. I think we just want to say, and hopefully we've demonstrated how much yin needs yang, how much visual needs verbal. Because when they come together, when we bring tone and visuals and copy together, they give us context and meaning. They give brands depth and real feeling as well. And Simon and I, like the visual and verbal parts of the yin yang, work together to create bold brands, unified, distinctive, memorable brands, because that's what makes bold. And we want to create brands that we can see ourselves in, brands that we can hear ourselves in as well, and brands that believe in themselves. And because the more confident a brand, the more unified its offering, the more visual and verbal come together, the more we're likely to connect with them. And as we said, to identify with them and see ourselves in them. And bold brands are just super confident, right? They believe in what they're saying, and they believe in what they're showing and what they're representing. They have real courage of their convictions. And bold brands, visually and verbally, they entertain us. They're confident. They can be playful as well. And they're not afraid to be different. And that will, again, help us to stand out in what can be a kind of a sea of sameness and similar sounding and similar looking brands. I will just come back to Star Wars briefly, Si, mostly because we have light side and dark side. We have yin and we have yang. So be more Yoda, I think. I use Yoda a lot when I'm talking about tone of voice and point of view, because no one sounds like Yoda. And we know how he looks, we know how he sounds. And that's super powerful. and it's super memorable as well. So yin and yang work really hard together, and be more Yoda.
There you go. There's one key takeaway you're going to get from the last 45 minutes. Be more Yoda.
Be more Yoda.
I love it.
Be more yin, more yang, to create universal, hardworking, distinctive, bold brands.
Love it.
Thanks, Si.
Cheers, Justin. See you in a bit.
Bye, mate. Bye.
Great job.